Tanking in Mist of Pandaria changes a lot from previous iterations of the game. Even looking at future expansions past MOP, this expansion stands out as an outlier in the way you approach the game as a tank and the impact a good tank can have in a dungeon and a raid environment. Every tank got a big overhaul in one way or another, along with the introductions of Brewmaster as a new tank on the block. In due time, we'll go over all the individual specs and how to approach them, along with the eventual releasing of the good old tanking tier list for Mist of Pandaria. So if you're interested in that, hit that subscribe button, as a ton of Mist of Pandaria content will be coming out over the next few months. In this video, we'll be talking a little bit more about tanking itself and what you can expect come Mist of Pandaria. So with that, let's get into it. First, I don't think we can talk about tanking and not talk about Vengeance. Vengeance in MOP got a huge overhaul, and it's the reason why tanks have such an enormous impact in raid, and why most tanks will make gearing choices that may seem orthodox to the traditional way a tank ought to gear. In Cataclysm, Vengeance is something that you pay very little attention to outside of making sure that you max Vengeance prior to popping offensive cooldowns. Your cap was equal to your stamina plus 10% of your base health, and taking 1 or 2 hits would all but guarantee that you capped out your Vengeance, and that max cap would all but be guaranteed to stay maxed throughout the fight, assuming you were actively tanking a target. In Pandaria, however, you'll be finding yourself paying much more attention to the Vengeance bar and plan your spells accordingly. When MOP Vengeance was originally released, it gave you 1.8% of unmitigated damage taken in the last 20 seconds as attack power, and it did not have any cap whatsoever. Since it was based on unmitigated damage, parrying, dodging, and absorbing damage would grant you Vengeance all the same. Using heavy defensive cooldowns would not negatively impact your Vengeance either. This led to some pretty crazy numbers, as you can imagine, and people were doing everything in their power to take as much damage as possible in order to get as high Vengeance as they could. Within a few months, Vengeance was ultimately capped at your max health. But granted that we have a health pool of around 500,000 in early Mist of Pandaria, with much more later on, the attack power values still got very crazy even with the nerfs. Around 8 months after the previous nerf, right as we were about to enter Siege of Orgrimmar, the last raid of the expansion, things with tanks had gotten a bit out of control, and thus it was time to nerf Vengeance even more. Firstly, the attack power portion was brought down from 1.8% to 1.5% of unmitigated damage. But the more important part was that you could no longer gain Vengeance from environmental damage, and getting crit would only grant you 50% Vengeance. So you remember how I said that people would be looking to take as much damage as possible? Well, I meant it. Before this change, people will be looking to stand in fire whenever possible, and assuming that the fight allowed for it, they would be spamming /sit in order to get crit to maximize their Vengeance gain. Now, in addition to that, tanking a large amount of mobs would reduce the amount of Vengeance based on how many targets you were fighting. So there was less of an incentive to have as many mobs as possible hit you at a time after the nerfs. While these changes were not applied to challenge modes in a raiding environment, this was the Vengeance that stayed in the game until Walls of Draenor, when it was ultimately replaced by the Resolve system, and since we've been playing on the last patch tuning for every Classic expansion thus far, it's pretty safe to assume that this is a tuning we'll see come up Classic. Even with the nerfs, you can expect as a tank to be on top of the damage meters for most of the heroic bosses, granted you take enough damage. And it also means you have to reevaluate your gearing approach and what stats will allow you to survive while also outputting big damage. In previous expansions, stamina has been king in most environments. And while stamina certainly has its place, it won't be the one primary thing we aim to obtain unless it's for a very specific purpose. Since we have such great output through our enormous attack power values, most tanks will generally want to focus on stats that increase their defensive utility while giving offensive value as well. For monks, this means that you'd rather focus on crit and haste rather than stamina and agility. For classes like DKs, you'd rather focus on parry and dodge than stamina and mastery as a rule of thumb. You might turn your head a bit and say, but Riani, how are dodge and parry offensive stats? Well, in Mist of Pandaria, all play users were given Riposte, which converts 75% of your dodge and parry into crit, and since crit is one of your most powerful offensive stats, you get to double dip by both getting defensive and offensive utility from one stat. Will there be a point where people will just crit for additional offensive utility? Absolutely. But that will most likely not happen until content is on farm. In Mist of Pandaria, you'll have a raid buff passively giving you 3000 mastery from paladins, shamans, or hunters, and thus a big portion of your defensive needs are met by that one buff alone. It's also worth noting that all tanks will be viable unless defined in the roles. It's true that classes like Brewmaster and Bloody Decay are generally preferred in a main tank capacity, at least early on, but you'll no longer have classes that are strictly relegated to being off-tank only specs, such as Feral Druids and Cataclysm. Feral Druid has been reworked into 2 separate specs, Guardian for tanking and Feral Druid for pure melee DPS. As such, it will no longer be a DPS increase for you to leave bear form to cat weave in order to squeeze out more DPS outside of possibly going cat during Heart of the Wild. Another thing that was more or less introduced in Mist of Pandaria, which had a huge impact on tanking moving forward, was the model of active mitigation. Bloody Case had already been working on this model since Cataclysm, which is part of the reason why they were simply miles ahead of every other tank. But now every single tank will have tools in their kit which they actively need to think about in order to be an effective tank. Of course, Bloody Case will keep their toolkit of death striking to heal and absorb physical damage while rotating a huge arsenal of small defensive cooldowns. Brewmaster Monk have 2 buffs they need to maintain through casting Blackout Kick, and to get enough crits to maintain as high uptime as possible of Elusive Brew, all while tracking their stagger, which is a new mechanic that reduces the damage they take up front, but you take the rest of the damage as a dot over time. That stagger can be purified back to 0, but that costs chi and thus directly competes with your ability to maintain your active mitigation buffs, especially early on where you're limited on secondary stats. Speaking of this trade-off, this is something we see a lot through Mist of Pandaria. Protection warriors will realistically have to choose between casting Shield Block and Shield Barrier, where one will be more potent against physical damage, with the other one being more potent against magical damage. Protection paladins will maintain their active mitigation through Shield of the Righteous, which reduces their damage taken by a minimum of 30% based on the mastery levels for 3 seconds. Maximizing holy power gain and stacking haze whenever possible will be your bread and butter, but there are situations where you like to spend your holy power on Word of Glory or Eternal Flame. Guardian Druids will have the same type of trade-off when it comes to healing and active mitigation in the form of Savage Defense, which gives 45% dodge for 6 seconds, and Frenzied Regeneration, which heals you based on how much rage you spend. Along with active mitigation, pretty much every tank can access to more defensive cooldowns, as to not have to rely on external cooldowns as much. Bloody Case do not get another defensive, but they do get access to a cheat death mechanic through the talent Purgatory. And if they don't go with Purgatory, they can get Anti-Magical Zone for the raid, which is incredibly powerful. Getting a Druid to use Symbiosis on you will also grant 1 additional defensive cooldown regardless of what tank you're playing. Tanks in general get access to more movement, which is important since you're responsible for keeping up the tempo in the raid, and being able to kite for short periods of time in challenge modes will also be very necessary. Speaking of challenge modes, as a tank, you will be the absolute main character. But I'm planning to release a challenge mode video very soon, and thus will reserve the tanking aspects of the challenge modes for that video. So if you'd like to check that out, subscribe so that you stay up to date for when it comes out. And I think that's where I'll leave off for now. So much more tanking information is on the horizon, but know this, you will have a blast tanking in Mist of Pandaria. But that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.